So we've discussed some basic formulas for the order in which chords appear, as represented by Roman numerals, but the real craft is how to move the four voices from one chord to the next. This is the heart of voice leading. Our job at this point is to help each voice find a home in each new chord. That means that every voice must be sounding a member of whichever chord it arrives at. There are ways of including pitches that don't belong to the governing chord, but we'll get to that much later down the road. When determining how to make any given voice fit within a new chord, think about following what 20th century composer and theorist Arnold Schoenberg called the law of the shortest way. In other words, move that voice to a member of the new chord with as little motion as possible. Let the voice go to the closest eligible member of the new chord. This almost always means avoiding large leaps, very often means using stepwise motion, and sometimes means simply leaving the voice on the pitch it already occupied. Now, this law is more important for the upper voices, soprano, alto, and tenor, than it is for the bass, especially in our first studies in which we're limiting ourselves to root position triads. As we move voices around, we have to consider how each voice moves relative to the other voices. There are four types of motion that characterize the relative motion between any two voices. In contrary motion, one voice moves upward while the other voice moves downward. If the higher of the two voices moves down while the lower voice moves up, the voices are each moving towards each other. If the upper voice moves upward while the lower voice moves downward, then the two voices are moving away from each other. In oblique motion, one voice maintains its previous pitch while the other voice moves either up or down. Similar motion occurs when two voices move in the same direction. One voice may travel by a wider or narrower melodic distance than the other, but their motion is similar simply by virtue of the fact that both are moving either upward or downward together. Parallel motion is a specific type of similar motion. Not only do the voices move in the same direction, but they also move by the same melodic interval. So if one voice moves down by step and another voice moves down by step at the same time, those voices are exhibiting parallel motion. There are a couple of practical rules of thumb with regard to the kinds of motion we talked about. From any chord to another chord, we want to avoid having all four voices move in the same direction. That means at least one of the voices should either stay put or move in the opposite direction of some other voice. This means that when moving between any two chords, you should create at least one instance of either contrary motion or oblique motion. Now, in order for oblique motion to happen, the note in question would have to be a member of both the prior chord and the chord that comes next. When a chord shares one or more pitches with another chord that follows, we refer to that pitch as a common tone. If that common tone begins its life in one of the upper three voices, the soprano, the alto, or the tenor, it is usually a good idea to hold the common tone into the next chord. This is the ultimate example of Schoenberg's law of the shortest way. The path doesn't get any shorter than not having to move at all. In writing among root position triads, you'll know you'll have a common tone and the bass moves by a leap of a fourth or a fifth. You'll have two common tones if the bass leaps by a third or a sixth. Maintain these common tones whenever possible. In our written work, we'll clarify common tones by drawing a tie between sustained pitches. Notice that the swoop of the tie goes in the same direction as the stems for the voice in which it is written. Sometimes we move between chords with neighboring roots. This is hinted at by the Roman numerals, which would be consecutive, as in a 4-chord moving to a 5-chord. In root position writing, this necessarily means that the bass voice will move by step. When this happens and both chords are triads, move all of the other voices in the opposite direction of the bass. Move those voices contrary to the bass. So if the bass moves up a step, all the other voices should move down. Note that the bass should not leap by a seventh. It should move between neighboring roots only through stepwise motion. There are a number of cautions to avoid in terms of types of motion, but if we stick to the recommended conventions discussed here and discussed going forward, we'll usually avoid most of those errors. Now consider that we're talking about voice leading in 4 parts using triads. That means we have more voices than notes in any given chord. As a result, each chord will feature some kind of doubling. Doubling happens when a particular member of a chord appears in 2 different voices at the same time. When voicing triads in 4 parts, doubling is obviously unavoidable. So how do we do it? When dealing with major and minor triads in root position, your best bet is to double the root of the chord. Another way of saying this is to double the bass, since the bass is the root in root position chords. Now I'll state right away that this rule will not apply when we talk about diminished chords later down the road. Diminished chords have their own doubling needs. If it's not practical to double the root, it's often okay to double the fifth. In minor chords, you can even get away with doubling the third on occasion, but you should avoid doubling the third in major chords. This doubling hierarchy of sorts has everything to do with the relative stability of the various members of the chords. The root is the most stable member of major triads and minor triads, therefore doubling that stable note minimizes the risk of any chord sounding unbalanced. The fifth is the next most stable member, and the third is the least stable of the three. Finally, a few very important guidelines about vertical spacing, or how we handle the distance between voices to maintain that balance between relative independence and interconnectedness. The distance between the soprano and the alto should always be within a single octave. The same goes for the spacing between the alto and the tenor. The spacing between the bass and the tenor is more flexible. That distance can and frequently does exceed an octave. Perhaps a simpler way of remembering this is to focus on the alto, which should always stay within an octave of both the soprano and tenor, the voices just above and just below it. We also want to avoid what is called voice crossing. This happens when voices swap relative positions with each other in any given chord. Simply put, this means that an upper voice should always sound notes that are higher than all of the voices below it, and lower voices should always have notes that are lower than all of the voices above it. A related but sneakier issue to avoid is called voice overlap. This error involves motion between voices from one chord to the next. It happens when an upper voice moves to a note that is below where a lower voice sounded in the chord just before, or vice versa, when a lower voice moves to a note higher than the note an upper voice just left. This is an error even when the voices don't technically cross during either chord. The overlap can still happen from one chord to the next. In our writing, we just need to recognize that each voice can only move to notes that are at or below the previous pitch of the voice above, and at or above the previous pitch of the voice below. So let's take a listen to the example we've been looking at for much of this video. This will give us a sense of how well handled root position voice leading can sound.